Row for the 2007 murders of Chris Newsom and Channon Christian. A total of 4 motions filed were denied.
Well, today, our deep dive is synthesizing a stack of sources detailing a tragic event known as the Nightmare on Chipman Street. We are looking at the 2007 Knoxville carjacking of Christopher Newsom and Channon Christian.
It's a heavy one.
It really is. And our mission here is to explore not just the timeline of what happened, but how a community, and particularly 2 absolutely devastated families, managed to rewrite the rules after just the worst imaginable horror.
Okay, let's unpack this, because this isn't just a story about the macabre details of a crime. It is a masterclass in profound human resilience that really demands our attention.
Absolutely. And if we connect this to the bigger picture, this deep dive is going to look at the anatomy of random violence, the deeply frustrating mechanical complexities of our justice system, and the societal ripple effects of tragedy.
Yeah, how it just bleeds out into everything.
Exactly. It's about understanding how an entire city processes a sudden influx of fear, and how individuals can actually force an immovable bureaucracy to change in the aftermath. So let's set the scene, because the contrast between the environment and the crime itself is just staggering. It's January 6, 2007, Knoxville, Tennessee.
Right in the middle of winter.
Yeah, and the backdrop is as peaceful and normal as you can get for a winter Saturday. It's chilly, there's this heavy fog rolling in over the pavement. Inside, restaurants are crowded, people are watching football games in their living rooms, just totally mundane.
The definition of a cozy winter weekend.
Right, and then you have these 2 young people. Christopher Newsom is 23 years old. He's athletic, hardworking, known for this really easy, immediate smile that just draws people in.
And his girlfriend, Channon Christian, she was 21. She was incredibly bright, caring, and just deeply loved by a massive circle of friends and family.
They sound like just great kids.
They really were. They were 2 highly responsible young adults spending a weekend evening together, laughing and decompressing. They had plans that night, the exact same kind of simple, mundane plans millions of us make every single day without a second thought.
But the horrifying reality is that somewhere in that same cold, foggy darkness, 5 violent criminals were actively moving through the city.
And they weren't targeting anyone in particular.
No, not at all. They were just looking, waiting, hunting for a vulnerability. And late that night, Christopher and Channon stopped near an apartment complex. And, that was the moment everything changed. They were ambushed. 5 armed attackers suddenly surrounded them, forcing them out of Christopher's SUV.
The sheer suddenness of it is what is so difficult to process psychologically. It happened far too fast for them to react or escape.
Just zero warning.
Right. The attackers stole the SUV, but they didn't stop there. They forced Christopher and Channon into the vehicle and abducted them.
It makes me think of that feeling when you're walking through your own house in the pitch dark. You feel completely secure because you know the layout, you know exactly where the stairs are, where the furniture is.
You don't even need to look.
Exactly. You are totally confident in your environment, and then suddenly, it's as if the floor just drops entirely out from under you. You're falling into an abyss, and you have absolutely no idea why or how it happened. It's the ultimate terrifying sliding doors moment.
That's exactly what it is.
If they had arrived 5 minutes earlier or parked 1 spot over, their entire lives would have continued uninterrupted.
That analogy gets right to the core of why random crimes like this are so deeply terrifying to us as a society. What we see here is the chilling psychology of the attackers. They viewed human lives entirely as objects.
Just prop.
Exactly, as entertainment. They operated under this grotesque belief that inflicting fear gave them power. When violence is inflicted purely for the sake of violence, without motive, without prior connection, it destroys our foundational assumption of cause and effect.
It just shatters it.
It does. It sends a message to the brain that the floor can drop out at any second for absolutely no reason at all.
And that lack of reason, that sudden, inexplicable absence, is exactly what their families woke up to the next morning. Because, like we said, Christopher and Channon were responsible.
Very responsible. They kept in touch.
Right. So the next morning, when their phones are going straight to voicemail and messages are getting 0 replies, it immediately sets off massive alarm bells for families who know their kids' habits.
Panic begins to spread very quickly, and rightfully so.
Yeah.
Initially, the local police are just dealing with scattered fragments, a missing SUV, they have some highly distressed parents, and eventually some confused witness statements from the apartment complex.
Just these isolated floating puzzle pieces. Which actually makes me wonder, when police are faced with just scattered fragments, a missing car, unanswered texts, how do they actually begin to connect those dots into a massive manhunt?
It's a great question, because you'd think it's a dead end, right?
Yeah.
But cars, especially even back in 2007, are forensic gold mines. What's fascinating here is how modern investigative work relies on data synthesis.
So it's not like the movies.
Not at all. It's not usually one grand aha moment where a detective finds a perfectly preserved fingerprint. It is the grueling, methodical process of weaving seemingly unrelated data points together to build a net. They don't just look at the car, they look at the geographic profile of where it was dumped.
Okay, so mapping it out.
Yeah. They pull trace fibers, they start canvassing for neighborhood surveillance timelines, and crucially, they begin looking at cell phone tower pings. In 2007, GPS wasn't as precise as it is today, but investigators could use tower sector data to triangulate the rough path the phones took that night.
So that narrows down the search grid.
Exactly. It gives them a physical area to focus on.
But before they could even finish that grid, the first horrifying break happened. Christopher's body was discovered near some railroad tracks. The crime scene was so brutal that veteran officers, people who had spent decades analyzing violence, were visibly shaken.
Which tells you a lot about what they walked into.
Absolutely. Yet, Channon was still missing.
And that possibility of her being alive changes the entire investigative protocol. It shifts instantly from a standard homicide investigation to an active hostage rescue.
So the rules changed.
They do. That means investigators can legally bypass certain procedural delays due to exigent circumstances. The urgency skyrockets. That data synthesis we talked about, the cell pings, the trace evidence from the SUV, the timeline of the dump, eventually points a laser focus onto a rental house on Chipman Street.
And from the outside, it was totally ordinary. Old, quiet, forgettable, the kind of house you drive past a million times and never notice.
Which is chilling in itself.
It really is. But police go in and it is absolute chaos. They find blood, restraints, broken furniture, the victim's personal belongings just scattered around. And then they made the discovery that everyone was praying against. They found Channon's body hidden inside the house.
It's just devastating.
It is, but there's a detail here that is just gut-wrenching, but I think so important. The physical evidence strongly suggested that during those terrifying hours, Christopher actively fought to shield and protect Channon whenever he could.
That detail is vital. It really is. It highlights their profound humanity in the face of sheer inhumanity. It shows that even in the darkest possible circumstances, human connection and the instinct to protect one another remained intact.
He never stopped trying.
No, he didn't. From there, the investigation exploded into a massive statewide manhunt. Detectives used the DNA left at the Chipman Street house, cross-referenced it with criminal databases, pulled extensive phone records to map the suspect's network, and systematically built that net until they could identify all 5 perpetrators and arrest them.
And you'd think that the arrests would be the end of the nightmare, right? The bad guys are caught, the forensic net worked, case closed.
You would hope so.
Right. But for the families, it merely opened the door to a completely different kind of agonizing marathon. Because now, they have to face the justice system. I always assumed a conviction was a conviction. You go to trial, you present the evidence, the jury decides, and it's done.
Yeah, that's the ideal version of how it works.
But this legal process stretched on for years.
The mechanical failures of the court system in this case are staggering. We were talking about multiple trials, a seemingly endless series of appeals, and incredibly complex legal disputes that kept stalling the finality of the process.
The system was completely tangled in controversy. The defense attorneys were challenging evidence, which, yes, is their constitutional job.
Sure, that's expected.
Right. But then you have this massive structural failure. The presiding judge, Richard Baumgartner, was actually facing severe accusations of misconduct.
It was much more than an accusation, actually. It was a catastrophic failure of the judicial pillar. This raises an important question about the unintended emotional burden the legal system places on victims' families. The controversy here wasn't about the evidence. The brutality of the crime was not in doubt.
Right, the facts were clear.
Exactly. The controversy was entirely about the structural mechanics of the law. Because of that judge's addiction, it was deemed a structural error. The convictions were thrown out, and the families were forced to endure retrials from square one.
That is just brutal.
They had to sit in that courtroom, facing the accused again, listening to the most horrific details imaginable, repeatedly. They weren't just fighting for justice, they were actively fighting the very machinery of justice, just to make it function correctly.
Well, eventually, they did secure those convictions again. The attackers received life sentences, with some facing the death penalty and additional penalties specifically tied to the kidnapping.
A small measure of relief, finally.
But the emotional damage of navigating that labyrinth was permanent. And those shockwaves didn't just stay inside the courtroom, they bled out into the streets of Knoxville. The entire city was paralyzed.
The macro-level impact on the community cannot be overstated. That unspoken social contract of safety we talked about earlier, it was shattered for an entire region.
Residents who previously felt totally secure suddenly became terrified. Parents are changing their routines, obsessively worrying about their kids going out. People are double locking their doors the second the sun goes down.
Everyone is looking over their shoulder.
Yeah, there was this heavy, suffocating atmosphere across the whole town. Memorials popped up instantly. Flowers, candles, handwritten notes covering fences and sidewalks. You have absolute strangers standing together, physically weeping over two young people they had never even met.
And that collective reaction is deeply significant from a psychological standpoint.
Here's where it gets really interesting to me. Why does that happen? Why do entire cities mourn strangers with such intense, almost personal grief? I mean, I understand feeling empathy, but this was a visceral, citywide paralysis.
When random violence occurs in a safe zone, it destroys that cognitive map for everyone sharing that space. When those strangers were standing at those memorials crying, they were, of course, mourning the tragic loss of Christopher and Channon. But psychologically, they were also mourning their own loss of innocence.
They felt vulnerable, too.
Yes, they were collectively acknowledging how incredibly fragile their own lives were.
But if fear had been the final legacy of this tragedy, the attackers would have won. Their goal of inflicting terror would have been the lasting impact. And the families of Christopher and Channon absolutely refused to let that happen.
They really did.
They moved the narrative from passive, paralyzing grief into active, relentless change.
They chose a path that requires an almost incomprehensible level of psychological resilience. Instead of allowing the tragedy to be the period at the end of the sentence, they turned their unimaginable pain into a driving legislative purpose.
They started working directly with lawmakers. They pushed for reforms to fix those exact trapdoors in the legal labyrinth they had been forced to navigate. And they succeeded. They helped pass new state legislation known as the Christian Newsom Acts.
Let's look at the actual mechanical loopholes these acts closed, because it is an estimate to how practical their advocacy was. The Christian Newsom Acts specifically targeted the procedural anomalies that had tortured their families.
What kind of anomalies?
Well, they tightened the rules around bail, ensuring that individuals accused of certain heinous violent offenses couldn't easily bond out and pose a threat to the community or flee before trial. They also overhauled elements of jury selection in capital cases to prevent localized bias or procedural errors from endlessly stalling trials.
So they basically looked at the very system that failed them, identified the exact broken gears, and forced the state to replace them.
Yes, they took a deeply personal void and transformed it into a permanent public shield. By getting those laws passed, they ensured that the names Christopher Newsom and Channon Christian are forever associated with systemic protection.
That's a beautiful legacy.
It is. They also created charitable foundations and community scholarships. They built programs designed to honor who these two people actually were in life, not just how they died.
Because Christopher was incredibly loyal, always the first to help a friend, Channon had this immense warmth and kindness that drew everyone to her. So what does this all mean? When I look at how true crime is usually consumed in our culture, there is this magnetic, almost voyeuristic pull toward the darkness.
Very much so.
We focus obsessively on the killers. We dissect the psychology of the attackers. We memorize the gruesome details of the crime scene. But these families fought tooth and nail against that tendency. They demanded that the world remember the inside jokes, the future plans, the vibrant lives that were stolen. Christopher was not just a headline. Channon was not just a crime scene.
It is a conscious, active choice to recenter the humanity of the victims.
It's so true. We learn the killer's name, but not the victims.
Exactly. The Newsom and Christian families recognized that danger and actively combated it. They understood that evil should never be allowed to have the final word, and it certainly shouldn't be allowed to erase humanity. Their actions remind us that while we cannot control the random acts of violence that occur in the world, we have absolute control over who we choose to remember and how we choose to build guardrails to protect the next generation.
And that brings us full circle on this journey. We started on a foggy January night where the illusion of safety was shattered by unimaginable horror. We navigated a tangled, incredibly frustrating justice system that structurally failed and re-traumatized the very people it was supposed to serve. We saw a city brought to its knees by the contagion of collective grief.
A really dark path.
But ultimately, we arrive at this incredible, inspiring testament of resilience. Two families who looked at the worst thing that could ever happen to a parent and decided to answer that hatred with a demand for justice and concrete legislative reform.
They prove that while evil may create temporary fear, love, advocacy, and remembrance can leave a structural legacy that outlasts that fear by generations.
It really makes you think about the fragility of those mundane moments we all take for granted. The drive home, the cold air, the quiet night. But I want to leave you with a challenge, something to really chew on long after we wrap up this deep dive.
Think about it carefully.
Think about the true crime stories you consume, or the news headlines you scroll past every single day. How much mental real estate do you automatically give to the names of the perpetrators versus the lives of the victims? If we, as a society, actively chose to memorize the light of the victims rather than the darkness of those who hurt them, how might that fundamentally change the way we view justice, our communities, and humanity itself? Next time you're driving in the fog, think about the light.